So welcome everybody, a warm welcome. So as I should imagine you know by now, since the new year we've been looking at a movement in Buddhism that emerged maybe 500 years or so after the Buddha's death, which called itself the Mahayana, the Great Vehicle, or the Great Way. And as we've seen, the Mahayana particularly emphasised the, if you like, the altruistic aspect of practicing the Dharma. It emphasised the fact that past a certain point in our practice, we're not going to get anywhere if our motivation is just about ourselves, if it's just about experiencing more pleasant mental states for our own benefit. Our motivation also needs to be about helping others, it needs to be a part of a bigger vision. We need to see it maybe in terms of us becoming part of the evolution of consciousness on this planet, or about us all becoming more enlightened, creating a more enlightened community or a more enlightened society. Not just about me becoming more enlightened so I can have a nice time. So we need that bigger vision, because becoming more enlightened is about going beyond a small limited self. And we can't do that if our aim is all about the small limited self. It's like the motivation then becomes in conflict with the goal. So it's a bit like being in a hurry to calm down or something like that. It's not going to work. And as we've also seen, the Mahayana expressed this bigger vision of practicing for all, not just for ourselves. It expressed it in terms of what it called the Bodhisattva ideal. So the Bodhisattva was the ideal Buddhist for Mahayana Buddhism. It was somebody who was practicing the Dharma not just to liberate themselves, but to be part of, as it were, the movement of liberating others as well. Part of the current moving in the direction of enlightenment for all. So Mahayana Buddhism it restated the Buddhist path, re-emphasising this sort of other regarding aspect. So it came up with other versions of the path, newer versions of the path, which just had that emphasis. They weren't anything new, they were just a restatement, a rejigging, but emphasising that aspect, shifting that emphasis a bit. And the simplest and the most well-known formulation of this Mahayana path, the Bodhisattva path, was called the 6 Paramitas. I hope you can read that. The light's a bit strange. The 6 Paramitas. Paramita is often translated as perfection, but that sounds a bit off-putting, I think, and it can be a bit misleading. Paramita can also be translated, it can be translated as perfection, but it can also be translated as something like way to the other shore, or way beyond. So the Paramitas are ways we can go beyond our small limited selfhood. They are ways to transcend our small limited selfhood. When we were talking about this series, Satyajoti suggested we call it the Buddha's Toolbox. The Paramitas on the Buddha's Toolbox, and I think that's actually up on the website. So yeah, the 6 tools to get us out of the prison of separate selfhood. So I sort of thought about this a bit like we're in prison, and somebody, the Buddha, has smuggled in a cake with 6 tools in it to help us get out of jail, right? So there might be a skeleton key and a file, and a hacksaw, and a chisel and a drill, and something else. Maybe a really folded up rope ladder in the cake. The 6 ways to get out of that prison of separate, limited selfhood. And these are the 6 Paramitas, the 6 ways, the 6 escape tools, the 6 ways to get beyond our separate, limited selfhood, which we'll be looking at over the next 4 weeks. Tonight, Satyajoti and myself are going to be talking about the first 2 tools of the cake. We're going to be talking about dana, generosity, or giving. And Satyajoti is going to talk about that in a while. And I'm going to talk about shila, ethics, or uprightness, or virtue, or a healthy self-discipline. As we said, one of the things to bring out about this whole list is that the last of of the Paramitas is prajna, wisdom. And wisdom is said to underlay, wisdom needs to underlay all the others. This is the wisdom of non-self, which tells us that we don't exist as separate, isolated individuals. We exist as in a way that's infinitely interrelated to others. We exist in a way we exist in connection. And the first of these two, the first two paramitas are ways that we can more and more live according to that wisdom. They connect us. And that's the sort of theme of tonight's talks, is that these two paramitas, the first two, generosity and ethics, they connect us. Simplifying quite a lot, you could say that these two paramitas are about two different aspects of ethics. We could see generosity as mainly as how we can live a life, act and speak in a way that connects us to others. And we could see Shila, the second of these, this sort of uprightness, as being about how we can live a life that connects us with what's best in ourselves and with what's highest in the universe. That's a sort of inward aspect of ethics that maybe is not so obvious, that I'll talk about in a little while. But first of all, Satyajyoti is going to tell us a bit more about the practice of dharma, how this tool in our cake helps us get out of the prison of our isolated, separate selfhood.
Okay, so dana, generosity, it's one of the precepts. So people just off the intermediate course will remember it as being a precept on the list. So it's one of the ethical principles that Buddhists live by. But it's also here, as Vedanta said, it gets its own spot. The very first of this path that you could follow to becoming a Bodhisattva, the very first, as Vedanta said, of those tools that can get you out of the prison of yourself. And I think that's because actually generosity is a really fundamental Buddhist practice. And it can take us through, it can be an experience, it's very down to earth, it's very human. I think being generous, the kind of reciprocity of generosity in a society is a very human thing. But it can also actually take us right through to manifesting the experience of the enlightened mind, the fully generous mind. And it kind of can express, I suppose, the wisdom of interconnectedness. Or, as Vedanta said, we're moving towards realising this lack of this fixed, separate self. And through generosity, we can actually start to do that. So, well, if you can't do anything else, you can be generous. So maybe you can't meditate, your head's too full of stuff, or you don't have time. Maybe you can't study the Dharma, you don't have enough time to do that. You don't have time for friendships in the Sangha, but you can practice generosity wherever you are, whoever you are. It's something that every single one of us can do, and we could do more of. And if we practice it wholeheartely, I think it can really put us in touch with the interconnectedness of all beings and this flow of reality of, we're part of a much bigger picture. We're just part of a flow of elements, a flow of ideas that we're part of. And in order to be generous, we really need to connect with others, actually. It is how we connect and how we can connect with others, because we have to come out of ourselves. And we have to appreciate that other people are living beings just like us, and they have needs and desires as well. And even if we do it in a very limited way, we have to realise that other beings have this kind of subjective experience too, which sometimes we can kind of forget if we're very busy, if we're very caught up in ourselves. So I think it can be very freeing, being generous, because it takes us out of this very sort of self-obsessed prison that I can certainly get into, and it allows us to connect with a much wider reality. And most of you will have come across the refuges and precepts that we chant them in pujas, and they do them in the morning before meditation here. And you might remember the generosity precept, which says, with open-handed generosity, I purify my body. And actually, when I'm doing that, I'm sometimes like got my hands like this, and I put my hands like that, because it's just a definite feeling of opening up, that kind of sense of open-handedness in generosity. And I can feel it on quite a physical level. But when I'm the opposite of generous, I can feel it on a physical level as well. I can just feel like kind of really tightening up and holding on and not letting go and wanting everything for me. A kind of really withdrawing and a real disconnection from the world. So when I'm the opposite of generous, when I'm kind of very anxious about me and mine, what I've got, well, it leads to me being even more anxious, actually. I start to worry about what I've got, that what happens if I lose that. I start to worry about what I don't have. And I become very separate and very disconnected from people. What I can start to think about all the time is just, well, what about me? I'm not getting enough, whatever it is. I need more. And that just, as I said, that really disconnects me. But I feel that in the process of becoming gradually more generous, it's like I can open my hands out. And in opening my hands out, I can connect more with others. And that's a pleasure. That's a real pleasure, actually. I'm sure all of you will know that feeling of, planning somebody's birthday party. Even better, getting together with other people to plan a gift that somebody else will like. And really just trying to work out what will give them pleasure, what will make them happy, and how much enjoyment there can be in that. And I think you also probably have the experience that I've had of when I've been feeling really self-obsessed and I've been able to break out of that, how freeing that can be, what a pleasure, what a joy that can be. So, how can we give? Well, there's a really good Buddhist list, which I haven't got written out actually, I'm not going to give you all of it. But what the Buddhist list says is that it can be a lot more than just material goods, a lot more than money and possessions that we can give. Although it's great to give those as well, they're very useful to people. There's a lot more than that. And things that we can give include time. We can give our time. And actually for many of us, that's something we're quite short of. And for many people who are living quite lonely lives, who are short of having, they don't have anyone to talk to, that kind of time that someone can give could be really important. We can listen to people. I think that's quite a precious gift, actually, to be really heard. So listening is something we can do to people. And perhaps listen without giving any advice. That can actually be really helpful to people as well, that they're just heard for who they are without any judgment. We can give a traditional thing, a precious gift, is fearlessness. So that's interesting that the Buddha actually has that in his list of things we can give. And fearlessness, well, we do live in very anxious times, actually. A lot of us, that's a big issue that we have to struggle with, is our anxiety. And I think being able to give a sense that actually we don't need to be quite so anxious, quite so nervous about things, that can be a real gift. And I think there are lots of other things we can give like that. So if we're quite happy, we can give happiness, we can give joy. You'll all know that experience of someone giving you a smile when you're feeling a bit low. That experience of someone giving you a big hello. The tanzal experience of someone giving you a hug, which is a really lovely experience. Another thing the Buddha talks about giving is education, which I think is a really important part of what we are given actually and what we can give. And the skills that we have, we can give to other people. And I think there's so many of those in many different ways. For some reason, when I was planning this, what came into my head is quite a few years ago, being with a friend of mine who's a bird watcher. And we were just in a car park actually, and he said, oh look, there's some short-eared owls, and they were flying round the car park, and I would never have seen them if he hadn't, it's twilight, I wasn't really looking for them, and he really gave me the gift, it felt quite magical, that gift of having those pointed out to me. So I think there's just so many different ways that we can give. And of course we can give the Dharma. I mean, that's a great thing to be able to give. We can either pass on ourselves, things that we learn to other people, or we can help places like this to exist so that the Dharma can go wider as well. I suppose what we're actually giving when it comes down to it is somehow we're giving ourselves. We're giving something of ourselves. We're giving a spirit of generosity. And that means, I suppose, making ourselves available to other people. What I think it comes down to is a way of thinking in the world, which is, instead of what can I get from this situation, it's what can I give to this situation. So probably most of us have been brought up, and it's a very natural thing, we'll be thinking in every situation, we'll go in and we'll think, oh, what can I get here? Okay. So at work, you might be thinking that, perhaps in all sorts of other social situations as well, in life, you're kind of in some ways trained to be thinking, what can I get from this situation? But actually a much happier way to live is to be able to go into a situation and think, what can I give to this situation? What can I do to make this situation better? And that might mean taking control and everything, but it might not be. Actually, what you might be able to give is somebody else can put themselves into that situation. What you might be able to give is just silence, doing nothing. That might be the appropriate thing to do. But it's just seeing what you can do in that situation. And again, my experience when I remember to do that is it immediately stops my kind of murmuring self-obsession that's going on, because I have to change the way I think. Instead of thinking all about how do I feel, it's like I broaden out. I literally do feel like I stand up a bit straighter and kind of go like this. And I think, what can I give here to make it better? And I think even if we're perhaps very ill, there are ways that we can give. If we're in situations that look like we don't have much to give traditionally, we can receive the care of others graciously. And perhaps we can be a bit generous towards our carers and their clumsiness. And actually, a very good thing we can do is we can accept other people's generosity in a kind way. We can accept compliments without kind of going, oh no, I don't think you're right. Well, that kind of thing that people can get into, where you don't feel like you can actually quite hear somebody's compliment. What we can do is actually accept that as well. Okay, so all these things I've been talking about, ways we can give. As you'll know from your own experience, they'll connect you with others. And I think they're also quite strong spiritual practices, actually, because you have to really develop your awareness, your mindfulness, to know what somebody needs. I think I used to be quite generous in some ways, but often I'd give people things I wanted to get rid of, rather than things they actually needed. And there was a certain lack of generosity in that, So we really need to have an awareness of others, what will be helpful to them. And we also need to have metta, kindness, loving kindness, in what will be beneficial to them. Because, sometimes we might give people things that actually aren't that, helpful to them, Okay, and I think another way that we can connect through the act of generosity is that when someone's generous to me, then I just naturally want to be generous back to them. And actually, I want to be generous to other people as well. It just seems to be that the natural response to someone being generous to me is a wish to pass it on to other people. Yeah, so I think generosity, so those are kind of quite mundane but very important ways, but I think it can be more than that as well. It's a bit like generosity can create a reality for ourselves which feels like we are richer people, actually, that we have more. Because, of course, we're just part of a process. So all the clothes that I'm wearing and all the food that I've eaten today and the fact that this building's heated and we're all here, it's all because of the generosity of other people. So I've just eaten lots of lovely food that people here cooked for me and made. You gave that food. And I completely rely on that generosity. And realising that, I think, allows us to feel a lot more grateful and a lot less kind of needing and wanting and craving stuff all the time. And the more generous I can be and the more I can realise it, the more I feel like, I think something deep inside me feels like I've got something to give. So if I can give somebody time, I feel like I've got lots of time. If I can give somebody some money, I feel like I've got lots of money. Because instead of concentrating on what I don't have, I'm concentrating on what I have got and what I can give away. So I can actually feel much happier, and I can create a self for myself in the future that is a more generous self, and that is therefore connecting much more with other people. Some people might be worried here that I'm kind of saying that what we need to do is give away everything and have nothing for ourselves. And I don't think that is at all what the Buddhist idea of generosity is about. Because that would mean we were disconnecting from our own needs, actually, if we did that. We're people just like everyone else. We're beings. And it's important that we have whatever we need for our own needs. I mean, I think often we think we need more than we actually do need. And that will give us unhappiness, if you see what I mean. But I think it's really important when we're thinking about being generous, we're not being martyrs at all. We're giving because we want to give. We're giving because we see the interconnectedness. And I think that for somebody who's been practicing for a long time, who's kind of further down the path than me, I can imagine them just living in this kind of flow of giving and receiving. Okay, and just a couple of things before I finish. So the first is that, of course, here, you probably know, we have what we call a dana economy of generosity. So all of us that are involved with the centre, we give what we can, and we take what we need as well in some ways. So we might come to classes, we might come to all sorts of things that are run here. We take in that way, but we might give money, we might give time, we might give food, as I've just said, you know, what we just had for supper. We give friendship. We just give, I mean, sometimes I walk into the centre and it's just so lovely because people are so warm and happy to see me. So I just really feel like I'm given a lot when I walk into the centre, that kind of warmth of people. So because what we're doing here is we're trying to do it on a basis of generosity, that's very different from the kind of transactional economy that's going on a lot outside the centre. And I think when you live in a transactional economy, what you're thinking is, well, I give you something, and in return, I want something else. And it's a very different way of living, actually. Like, I was lucky enough that when I was a student, I got all my fees paid and got grants and all that kind of stuff. And then later on, I went and did a course where I had to pay for it. And my attitude was so different. It was really interesting, actually. Yeah, because I was kind of, it's a bit like I'd given some money and I expected something in return, that kind of sense. And I hope what we don't do here is ever set that up. It's a bit like we're all giving, we're all trying to create together the Buddhist Centre. We're not some of us giving stuff and other people paying for it, I hope. Okay, and then I'll just finish by this idea that how generosity can actually kind of lead us into realising and in fact manifesting ourselves this deep interconnectedness of all beings. And I suppose the perfection or the paramita, this idea of the perfection of generosity or the going beyond of generosity, one day it will be as if there's no self who's giving, there's no idea of a receiver of the gift, and there's no idea of the act of giving. And actually that sounds kind of quite strange, but we do it all the time in very mundane ways. So if I was just eating with you and I said, pass the salt, you're very unlikely to go, here I am, a very generous person who is passing the salt to Satyajoti, who is going to be very grateful that she received it. It's more you go, oh, okay, she needs some salt, I'll give it to her. Do you see what I mean? So you're not putting any ideas in there about yourself or me or the act of giving. You're just doing it. And I think if you've ever found yourself in a position where there's an emergency going on, something quite extreme, and you need to give, often we just give really naturally. It's very easy, you know. If there was, often when there was the floods and things like that, people who live nearby very naturally give. And you do it without too much thought. It's just a kind of natural thing to do. And I think what we're talking about with this kind of much more, this idea of sort of transcendental generosity, it's like that, but on a much bigger scale. So it's a bit like the whole of our lives are just lived in this generosity, this giving, this receiving, without having lots of ideas about ourselves as the giver or as the receiver. Okay.
Sometimes felt a bit confused about these two, dana and shila, because shila means ethics, so presumably it's the 5 precepts, and generosity is one of them. So what's the difference? What's the difference between why do you need 2? Why don't you just have shila? And generosity is included in it. Surely generosity is part of that. And then generosity and kindness. How do you separate those two? So why have 2 separate aspects? Why have dana and shila? Why not just shila? So I think maybe we can make sense of that if we think of those as 2 different aspects of ethics. As Satyajyotis told us, living a generous life connects us to others. It breaks down the walls that separate us from others, and it creates community, it creates Sangha, it creates spiritual community. And that's an important part of what we think of as ethics, that it connects us to others. In fact, all the precepts, I think, have that sense of either connecting us to others or stopping us from disconnecting to others. If we get stuck in cycles of craving, we get very cut off from others. If we're dishonest and crooked in our communication, we cut ourselves off from others. If we're unaware, we're cut off from others because we don't know they're there. So in a way, all of the precepts have that sense of connecting us to others. Maybe the precept about generosity is, as Sachijoji says, the most obvious, and it's something that we can all do. So our ethical practice is about that outward connection, connecting to others. But there's another aspect to ethics. And this is maybe the aspect that's being emphasised when Shila is looked at as something different from Dana. And that is that ethics is also about what we do to ourselves. It's not just about what we do to others, it's about what we do to ourselves. Because acting ethically connects us to what is highest in ourselves. If you want to use this language, it connects us to our higher self. Acting unethically cuts us off from what's best in ourselves, cuts us off from our higher selves. If we want to be more accurate, we could say that acting ethically connects us to our potential for Buddhahood. And acting unethically cuts us off from that. Or it cuts us off from our connection with the higher, if you like, our Shraddha. So one way of making sense of this division into Dana and Shila, seeing them as separate things in the list, could be to say that Dana emphasises the aspect of ethics which is about connecting to others, while Shila emphasises the aspect of ethics that are about connecting with what's best in us, if you like, or what's highest in the universe. Because when we get caught up in, say, ill will, or when we get caught up in addictive cycles of craving, or when we act in ways that are mean or crooked and dishonest, we cut ourselves off. We lose contact with what's best in ourselves. And that makes us very, very unhappy. Because the only real deep happiness, the only source of deep happiness we've got, is to be in touch with what's best in ourselves. Our higher self, if you want to call it that. I think if you think about your experience, you'll see that this is true. You'll see that, you know, some of the things we do to make ourselves happy, like, oh, let's have loads of chocolate biscuits, or, you know, let's get into some, I want some of that, let's have some of that, etc. They don't make us happy. They just sort of distract us from our dissatisfaction for a while. And the times that we're really happy tend to be when we're in touch with something really golden in ourselves, something that's really full of light in ourselves, when we feel genuinely good about ourselves, when we're in touch with a vision of ourselves as, if you like, a higher being, in touch with the light inside ourselves. That's when we feel really happy. And I think it's worth making this distinction between, as it were, the outer effect of ethics, connecting us to others, and the inner effect of connecting us to what's best in ourselves. Because I think in the West, sometimes our understanding of ethics is a bit one-sided. Often, I think our Western understanding of ethics is that it's all about what we do that affects others. Ethics is all about how we affect others. What we do in private, or what we do that doesn't directly affect others, is our own business. It's not important in an ethical sense. That tends to be the Western view. But that is actually a very one-sided viewpoint. So an analogy for this is that, say, imagine that we human beings are a convoy of ships. We're a convoy of ships sailing together through some very dangerous seas, hopefully towards enlightenment. We're a convoy of ships sailing together through some dangerous seas. And the Western view of ethics tends to be that, okay, ethics is about, in this convoy of ships, you do not ram other ships. You do not empty your rubbish overboard onto other ships. You do not toss heavy things off into the other ships are going to collide with. It's all about what you do directly to affect other ships. But actually, you can do none of those things. You cannot ram other ships, throw your rubbish in the sewage over them. But if you let your radar get faulty, if you let your sonar get faulty, if you let your steering gear get rusty so that you're veering all over the show, then, well, you've become a mess, but you will harm others. You will veer across their path. You will get lost in the fog and someone will have to come and rescue you. instead of being a positive force in the convoy, if you let yourself become a mess, you'll become a hazard. Instead of being part of this movement towards the convoy towards enlightenment, you'll be something that gets in the way, that harms others, that puts others at risk. So, we'll not only end, if we become a mess ourselves, we not only make ourselves very unhappy, we also end up harming others. And this, of course, is because of the law of karma. The way we speak and the way we act and the way we live our life has a profound effect, not just on others, but on us, and then we have an effect on others. As we often say in our introductory classes, we've got all these different strands in our being that are historical, they're created by our conditioning, positive and negative. We don't have any choice about that, but we do have a choice about the ones we act on. And the ones we act on, the strands in our being that we act on and put our energy behind, they become stronger. They become more habitual, they become more and more who we are, while the aspects we don't put energy into gradually shrink and fade away. If we act as a wiser, more loving, more straightforward, more whole person, we become a wiser, more loving, more straightforward person. Our actions create the person we will be in the future. And if we act on our negative impulses, we will make ourselves a more deluded person, a more self-obsessed person, a more devious and secretive person, a less aware person. Our radar and our sonar will stop working. Our steering gear will get rusty and we'll start veering about. We'll get wonky and unreliable. We'll become a mess. And instead of a positive force in a convoy, we'll be a nuisance. We'll become a hazard and an obstacle. And we will also become very, very unhappy. We'll be an unhappy ship with, where the officers are arguing and there's lots of negative emotion and moaning going on. So this is an aspect of ethics that tends to get ignored in our culture and which is very much to the fore in Buddhism, which we really need to take on board. I think in some ways in our culture, we might still be in reaction to some of the more unhealthy aspects that can come along with ethics in theistic religions, sort of, Victorian Christianity. So ideas like virtue or purity have somehow got contaminated, they've got twisted, so that we think of them as something prissy or weak or goody-goody. Who wants to be virtuous? Who wants to be a goody-goody? Who wants to be pure? So I think we need to redefine those words. We need to redefine those words to get back to something closer to their original meaning, so that we see the beauty of virtue, so that we develop a love of virtue, so that we want it. We want to be virtuous. The original meaning of virtue is anything but prissy and weak. Virtue meant the personal power that comes, if you like, from wholeness, from integrity. The strength that comes from living by positive principles and being upright. So synonyms, my dictionary, good source here, my dictionary gives some synonyms as synonyms for virtue, including integrity, dignity, honour, nobility, merit. Who wants to lack integrity? Who wants to be crooked? Who wants to be dishonourable, to be ignoble? Those are ugly qualities. The positive qualities are very, very beautiful qualities. And when we act in ways that, in a way, are ugly, it's as though our higher self distances itself from us. A little bit smelly, It's sort of like it's repelled by our ugliness. It can't manifest in that sort of ugly environment. So we lose our connection with what's best in ourselves, and we feel very miserable. So my dictionary also tells me that the word virtue derives from the Latin virtus, which means, among other things, courage and valour. So hardly sort of weak-kneed virtues. Courage and valour. Rather strangely, it also says that it derives from the root vira, meaning man. Of course, this doesn't mean that it's got anything to do with gender. But what it does mean is that it was originally connected with a sort of warrior ideal that was associated with men. So virtue was what knights aimed for. It was the knightly ideal of strength in a noble cause, a worthwhile cause, that went along with all those adjectives that I've mentioned, like integrity and dignity and nobility. And in a similar way, we can think that the idea of purity is a bit wishy-washy and goody-goody. But what pure really means is undiluted, like pure alcohol. Pure means powerful, because not mixed and diluted and weakened, but like pure dynamite. So I think it's maybe important to go into the meaning of those words a little, because it's important that we free ourselves from some of the negative associations of this sort of inwardly directed ethics that can be there in our culture and maybe affect us without our knowing it. I think we need to develop that sort of love, a love of virtue, a desire for it. So that we want to be virtuous, so that we want to bring out what's best in ourselves. And in a way, we also maybe need to see the ugliness of the opposite, so that we don't want them, so that we shy away from them. Who wants to be crooked, dishonourable, ignoble? Who wants to behave in ways that are full of craving or dishonest, etc.? So we need to shy away from that, because when we don't, well, as I said, it cuts us off. It cuts us off from what's best in ourselves. It cuts us off from what's highest in the universe. We lose our connection with our higher self, and then we feel very, very miserable. I think there are a couple of problems. So I think it's really important that we connect with this idea of, yeah, we want to be that sort of person. We want to be, if you like, a virtuous person in that sort of strong way. But I think there can be a couple of problems about the practice of ethics that we really need to take on board. And the first is that we really need to accept and forgive ourselves for being the conditioned beings we are. Okay? We often got this really unrealistic idea of ourselves when we perhaps start practicing. And then we suddenly realise when we start trying to practice the precepts that we don't. That we've got all these sort of drives and tendencies that are at odds with practicing the precepts. And maybe then we can be really hard on ourselves, actually. So we need to accept and forgive ourselves for being the person we are now. The past has made us this way, and there is no good in beating ourselves up about it. We start where we start. So we need to accept that, but not accept that we're going to be that way forever, not accept that we're not moving in the direction of change. We need to, at the same time, move in the direction of change, and we will change if we practice. But we also need to accept it won't happen all at once. We can't change at once, and I think all at once. I think one problem that some people experience with ethics is suddenly trying to be too idealistic, suddenly wanting to behave like an arahant or a bodhisattva, when there's whole loads of ourselves that are moving in very strongly in different directions. So to be ethical means to have a kindly, healthy self-discipline that takes into account where we're starting from. It comes from metta and it takes into account where we're starting from. To be ethical is to be genuinely kind to ourselves, because it's doing the things that are genuinely going to make us happy, because it's going to put us in touch with, if you like, that inner gold, that inner light that we have. So we need to be kind for ourselves. We need to be kind to ourselves. But that is very, very different from being self-indulgent. So there's a sort of tightrope here, isn't there, between being overly harsh on ourselves, being overly sort of idealistic, and being self-indulgent on the other hand. Being self-indulgent is like just accepting that we are, in a way, flawed beings with all these negative drives without trying to do anything about it. Just, oh yeah, pass the chocolate biscuits. Oh, that's not the most unethical thing in the world, but hey, that's what I do. That's what I do. Who can expect any different? So somewhere there's a middle way here, which is a sort of tension. And I think the second thing to say about to beware in our practice of ethics is to beware of a harsh, puritanical attitude. I think our practice of ethics can be driven by a sort of unkind spirit, actually. It can be driven by unkindness. unkind to ourselves and unkind to others. It's a bit like there's a sort of domineering authority figure somewhere inside us who doesn't like us and doesn't want us to enjoy life. It's as though, the wicked stepmother or something, or the terrible matron in the orphanage. You're horrible, you horrible little children. With a sort of wagging finger, always wagging a disapproving finger. I think it could be a bit difficult to spot this when it's fingers wagging at ourselves. You might try it in your meditation, So if you're sitting there in your meditation and the thought comes up, oh, you're useless at this. Oh, there's another. It's that figure. I tell you, shut up. It's that figure. It's that figure. So beating ourselves up, avoid beating ourselves up about our ethical failures, okay? Ethics is a training. We're training ourselves. So it's good. It's actually positive. It's a positive emotion in Buddhism when we sort of feel disappointed and even shame in our own, sort of falling below our own standards. But we have to draw a distinction between that and a sort of lack of better to ourselves, a sort of being really hard on ourselves. It's only positive when we move on from it. If we sort of spend our time feeling depressed or disillusioned because of our ethical failures, then it's not good. It is really not good. And we can get into this situation if we've got that sort of puritanical, over-idealistic approach to ethics, where we veer between sort of setting up really high standards for ourselves, which we keep to for a while, and then getting sick of that, and going off and doing the things we usually do, and then really giving ourselves a hard time, which makes us really unhappy. So then we go, no, I'm never doing that again. I'm absolutely never doing that again. And we just veer between these two extremes of, in a way, self-indulgence and self-beating up. And in a way, they get further and further apart. So we really need to avoid that. It can be easier to spot this sort of unkind spirit in our ethical practice when it concerns others. If we find ourselves condemning others for their ethical failures, I suggest that can be a sure sign that there's something a bit awry in our approach to ethics. Next time you find yourself thinking, I saw them and they were eating a burger. Or whatever it may be. Or why don't they? They don't take out a standing order to the Buddhist Centre. I'm sure they've got a really good job. Whatever it is. The next time we find ourselves doing that, maybe it might be a good idea to think, do I ever do anything similar? And is it the case that what I'm in fact doing is projecting my disapproval of my own ethical failures onto that other person? So that, there's a sort of unkind spirit going on, which I've deflected the unkindness towards myself onto others. I think that can be a really sure sign that we are, there's something a bit off in our approach to ethics, and maybe we need to focus a lot more on metta, actually, for ourselves and others. We need to be aiming for a healthy, nurturing self-discipline that moves us in the direction of becoming happier, more useful beings, not giving ourselves a hard time, and certainly not giving others a hard time. So just to sum up, I think we do need this, I really believe we need this sort of positive sense of virtue, a positive love of virtue, a desire to move in that direction, a desire to be what should we say, a more light-filled being, a being filled with goodness. But we also need to combine that with kindness and forgiveness for ourselves and for others. We are not enlightened, and we are all of us are always going to be unskillful until we're enlightened. It's just the way it is. We're always going to be breaking the precepts. We're always going to be acting in unskillful ways some of the time. What we need to do is get back on the tightrope and carry on walking. In terms of ourselves, one of the things we need to do is to move on from that. And one way of moving on from that is to apologise to others when we do it. And something else we need to do is not get into this sort of condemning others attitude, but readily forgive others their ethical failings, because, hey, we're like that too. Okay. So a little bit about how Dharma can connect us with others, and how Sila, this sort of inner aspect of ethics, can connect us with what's best, what's golden in ourselves, which is our source of true happiness. The only source of true happiness, and also the way that we can be most used to others and stop being part of the problem and start being part of the solution. Thank you.